Well, good morning, everyone. Yesterday was a difficult day for me. Sometimes we have an opportunity as ex-senators to do things that are exciting and fun, like this event. And other times we have to use our time to face up to some real problems that our great country has. So if you think any of you saw me yesterday in my physical appearance and you think I look a little bit better today, I would tell you you're right, because I feel a lot better. I'm talking about something I love to talk about. And yesterday, I talked about something I love to talk about, but I'm frightened every time I hear the subject of the American debt and the debt crisis and our inability to do anything about it at the political level in these great United States. If those of you who are enamored with nuclear power because you understand how safe it is and what it can do for current livers in the world and what it can do for humanity over decades, for those that are in that regard positive and wanting to move ahead, it is fun, sometimes difficult, but you feel good about it. But I do want to say to you that on two subjects, you can't sit by just because you know something about nuclear power and are enamored and positive about it. You cannot sit by and watch your nation do nothing about the fiscal policy of the giant democracy of all times. And you must on that be convinced by someone. Be me, somebody already, something you've read, but you must be convinced as informed citizens that the problem is enormous on the debt side, but it can be solved. It isn't like you have to do what Greece did the first time through and annihilate programs such that nobody in the populace wants to support it because it's like, what's better? Death by hanging or death by getting run over by a 16-wheeler. But in any event, I was privy to an exciting 4 hours yesterday on the best testimony I've heard in my nigh on 80 years of age on the subject of the debt versus democracy versus America in the world. And this morning, you are all privileged by 1 o'clock or 1:15 to hear from some really great and involved people in the subject of nuclear power. I'm not one of those whom you need to spend time listening to, at least not very much, because I'm fully aware that in the United States, those who want to keep alive nuclear power have some very difficult obstacles, tough obstacles. And the new one that was added to us just about 3 years ago, you all understand, is the technological breakthrough on the development of shale oil, shale gas in large quantities, which heretofore we didn't think we had. Now that's added another burden along with the interpretation internally and otherwise of the 05 Energy Act and its provisions for long-term financing, which have just about become unworkable and deserve much more time and attention. But because of the difficulties in campaign and time coming close to elections, that too is on the back burner in America. But I guess we can say that even though we have 104 nuclear reactors in our country, more than any other country in the world, and we have the burden of keeping those alive, and they're doing a magnificent job of supplying energy, clean energy, and they're wearing out, and we have to start looking at how we're going to replenish them. It obviously is difficult in America to think about new reactors here now, although that is being done and we're making some headway. But because of the price of natural gas, because of America's economy that has not been growing sufficient for long-term plans for those who need nuclear power to come into fruition, and we all know that nonetheless in China, in India, and in a few other countries in the world, and the continual prowess of South Korea, putting together the components of nuclear power so they can have it at home and beat everybody else out there in the world and competing to build it there, teaching us a lesson on some of it. So I want to close this part of my remarks by saying we have that additional problem of nuclear waste in America. And just as I've invited you to get yourself familiar with the debt of your country and insist that your representatives do something about it, I wanted to say that on this issue of what we do with our nuclear waste, if I had my druthers, I would give you all a free pass in whatever kind of equipment we could put you in and ship you down to Carlsbad, New Mexico, every one of you, and let you take a day and a half and go through WIP, the Waste Isolation Pilot Project, and then come back to this meeting and we'd talk about what's up. America already knows how to dispose of nuclear waste. The WIP, the Waste Isolation Pilot Project, shows you that. The members of the Blue Ribbon Commission went and saw it. They left, every one of them that went, convinced that we're that close to having one already built, the one that's handling transuranic military waste. And what a lesson it is to how to do it, and yet we put all of the pluses from that into the Blue Ribbon Commission, and we can't get the executive branch of government moving yet. I don't know what's the matter. We can't get a bill yet moving along, and I'm in no way addressing this to any of our speakers. In particular, I'm not addressing it to the one that follows me. I did see him walk in, and so I held my remarks until he got seated and then got on whip. He's been there. He understands whip. He needs no education whatsoever. So, friends all, I want to tell you there's still a lot of things for America, that means many of you, to be proud of when it comes to nuclear power. There is no entity that exists in the world that men and women have put together that deserve more accolades than the Nuclear Power Commission. The distinguished woman that spoke to us, the commissioner, gave us a background of its brilliance, its background of what it can do for nuclear power for us and for the world. And believe you me, that we can be proud of the NRC. No question about it. It is a living example of applied scientific expertise. Now with that, I want to say I've been privileged to have 4 events in the area of nuclear power as part of our year at the Bipartisan Policy Center. I was accompanied in that effort by another Pete. At one point we had 3 Petes. We had Pete Lyons, he's high up in this area. We had Pete Miller, he was the actual assistant secretary in charge, and he left and put the other Pete in, and I was Pete on the Hill. And between us, there was nothing we couldn't do, although they were moving the Democrat agenda and I was trying to get something else done. Nonetheless, we remain great friends and they've accomplished considerable. With that, let me say we're privileged today to have with us as our speaker a very distinguished person. He now holds a high position in this field, and let me introduce him to you. Deputy Secretary of Energy, Dan Poneman. He was confirmed as Deputy Secretary of Energy May 18, 2009. He first joined the department in '89 as a White House Fellow during the 90s. He served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Non-Proliferation and Export Control at the National Security Council. His other positions are just as stellar as the ones I've just stated. So would you join me not only in welcoming him, but in thanking him for taking of his busy time to join us today with all the problems he has. For him to come and spend time with us is a clear evidence that he understands many of us must work together to solve this problem of science that is all tied together in the idea of producing nuclear power. Thank you. Welcome to the Secretary.
Thank you, Senator. Well, it is a distinct honor to be introduced by somebody with such a stellar record in this field, and I'm sure that the large turnout here today is in no small part a tribute to you, sir. And if I may say, I think this gentleman, for his decades of tireless, wise, and if I may say visionary leadership in this area, deserves a very warm round of applause. Of course, Senator Domenici is too modest to tell you the fact that his influence has been so great that the last two Assistant Secretaries of Energy for nuclear energy have named themselves after him. That's how that Pete Lyons, Pete Miller thing got happening. So, and I also want to acknowledge all of the groups that have come together in the various studies that are being presented for people's consideration. This is exactly what we need. We need to have a robust discussion. These are critical issues, and they deserve a thoughtful and extensive conversation. We've been having such a conversation, and the rather gentle reproach that I received from Senator Domenici 3 or 4 minutes ago was like a walk in the park compared to some of the things that we have been dealing with lately. So I welcome this opportunity. It's obviously a challenging time for nuclear energy, but as President Obama said in the Rose Garden just a few days after the March 11th events at Fukushima, the United States, while we need to drink deeply from the lessons of Fukushima, also continues to view nuclear energy as an important part of building a low-carbon future. He's made it clear that he sees nuclear as an integral part of the all-of-the-above approach to American energy policy, which has really transformed our energy economy and I think opens up a very promising and exciting new era for American energy, and yes, all that goes with it, because when we have effective and successful energy policies, it drives manufacturing, it drives technology, it drives exports, it drives jobs, and the power of that sector and the power of America's role in that sector are truly astounding to observe. I want to talk about the challenges that nuclear must continue to address successfully in order to succeed. And when we talk about those challenges, first, you have to talk about safety, and I'd like to echo Senator Domenici's remarks and thanks to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for the great work that it has done and continues to do to keep us all safe. It's important to recognize, and certainly we at the Department of Energy do recognize, that safety is not an afterthought, it's not a bolt-on. Safety is integral to the nuclear energy mission. We don't have a mission just to deliver nuclear energy. The mission is to deliver nuclear energy safely. And in light of the accident in Fukushima, President Obama requested that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission conduct a review of the 104 operating plants in the United States domestic fleet of nuclear power to ensure that they could continue to operate safely, knowing what we know about the events in Fukushima. And last July, a high-level NRC task force completed their 90-day review of the agency's regulatory oversight and safety standards, and they concluded that we could continue to operate those units safely. And of course, they are taking into account their own recommendations on what improvements can be made, and they will continue to be pursuing those. So we will continue to incorporate those lessons, and we will continue to make sure that both in current generation and next generation facilities that we take all of those into account as we proceed. I think it's also important to recognize that, as we have said, anything that happens in nuclear space is by definition a global event. There are no boundaries that extend from the Earth upwards. So, as we have often said, an accident anywhere is an accident everywhere. And so it is fitting and proper that the entire global community took into account these lessons. Last June, the International Atomic Energy Agency hosted an important meeting in Vienna. I had the privilege to represent the United States and talked about things that had to be done, that should be done in terms of peer review, best practices, ensuring that we had adequate inspections to support our safety in all of our civil nuclear activities, and that, I think, led to a very much wider set of understanding among the countries of the world who are now either pursuing or contemplating their own nuclear energy futures. And it is something that is a task that's never really done, but that we must continue to excel, work, compare notes, make sure that we take full account of all the learnings that we can share with one another. And in that spirit, the Japanese government will be hosting here in a couple months in December at Fukushima a conference at the ministerial level on nuclear safety. So both at the national level and at the international level, safety will continue to be the watchword. Safety is absolutely essential to our continued success in pursuing the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. But equally clearly, just as a nuclear safety accident anywhere is an accident everywhere, so too, if there were, God forbid, a proliferation incident anywhere, so too would the implications be global of that. And therefore, we must be equally assiduous, equally dedicated, equally focused on preventing the threat of the diversion of nuclear technology, of nuclear materials, and of course, of nuclear weapons. And we have been very focused on that. That's why President Obama, in a transformational nuclear posture review, put stopping the threat of nuclear weapons proliferation and nuclear terrorism at the very top of our nuclear agenda. It's the continuing challenge that we all face that represents the greatest threat to all of us, exceeding the threats that traditionally had preoccupied us in building our strategic force during the Cold War. This is a much greater threat than that. And the President laid out a very clear and compelling vision in Prague way back in April of 2009, in which he expressed his vision of a world without nuclear weapons, recognizing that that may not be realized in our lifetime, recognizing that while we kept that deterrent, it needed to be safe, secure, and effective, but also equally recognizing the threats of proliferation, committing the United States of America to the lockdown of all fissile materials that could be used for nuclear weapons within 4 years, and committing there, and not only there, but at the Nuclear Security Summit, an unprecedented event that he hosted in April 2010 in Washington, to a series of steps by the largest gathering of leaders of government that had responded to a presidential invitation since Harry Truman invited the member nations to join in San Francisco to set up the United Nations in 1945. That level of discourse, that level of commitment is absolutely necessary if we were to come to terms with the challenges that are presented by nuclear proliferation. At that summit, leaders committed to taking a number of definitive actions aimed at strengthening nuclear security and reducing the threat of nuclear terrorism. By the time of the subsequent summit hosted in Seoul last year by the Republic of Korea, 92% of those commitments had been completed because specific steps had been created to improve nuclear security and counter nuclear smuggling in over 30 countries. Now, we all realize that nuclear security and nuclear power are inextricably linked by physics. You cannot deny the fact that the same physical process of splitting the atom, depending on the pace at which it is performed and the scale, can either release heat that will heat water and drive turbines, and obviously in another setting can set off a nuclear explosion. And that's why the President in Prague called for a new international framework for peaceful nuclear cooperation that could assure that all nations that live up to their international nonproliferation norms can rely on the commercial marketplace to provide them with the fuel services that they need to operate their nuclear power plants. And that vision is something that we continue to work on. I would like to acknowledge now many of my colleagues. This would be an even larger audience, but a number of my colleagues who would otherwise be delighted to be here are actually this week in Vienna at the International Atomic Energy Agency General Conference being led by Secretary Chu. And many of the conversations that they're having in the hallways are dealing precisely with the challenge of how best to pursue the civil nuclear energy proposals and programs that the countries represented there are pursuing in a manner that's safe, secure, and that has the minimum proliferation risk. If we do this right, this new international framework can provide a mechanism to strengthen our national security, strengthen global security, reduce proliferation and nuclear terrorism threats. Now, having addressed the fundamental issues of safety and security, there is still a further road that needs to be traveled when it comes to nuclear energy and the prospects for nuclear energy in this country and in other countries around the world. Quite simply, American nuclear energy must be competitive if it is to be successful, and in that respect, I think the kind of public-private partnership that we've seen over many years is going to continue to be very important. Nuclear energy as an energy source was invented in this country, and the United States has always been a global leader when it comes to nuclear energy. We still obtain 20% of our overall electricity from nuclear power. About 70% of our carbon-free electricity comes from nuclear power. So it is in our interest and in the interest of the global community that we continue to play that kind of a role. Now, our domestic industry, and I'm sure you'll be hearing more about this during the course of the day, faces a number of challenges in current energy markets. Obviously, the recent developments over the last few years, the absolute transformation of U.S. natural gas markets with the prodigious expansion from something on the order of 1% of U.S. domestic gas supplies a decade ago coming from shale gas, now over 30%, and consequently the steep drop in the price of natural gas, which makes building a natural gas plant quicker and cheaper. That's something that any utility executive, any proposed purchaser of installed power in this country is obviously going to have to weigh very carefully as they are making their energy decisions. So in light of that fact, in light of the fact that nuclear power plants in the traditional quite large configurations consume enormous amounts of capital. The largest cost by far, obviously, in a nuclear power plant is the upfront capital expenditure, and over the long term of the several decades in which it operates, the low fuel prices and the modest operating costs allow you to be very successful from a utility perspective, but that upfront cost is a major challenge and one that we need to think hard about how to deal with. Again, we just heard Senator DeMint talking about the loan guarantee program. It was a proud moment, I think, for this nation when, for the first time in 3 decades, with the support of the loan guarantee on the order of $8 billion that was made available for the Vogtle project, which did, as was intended, unleash additional private capital, we saw the first domestic nuclear power plant get licensed to be built in the United States in over 3 decades. So that shows that certainly in regulated markets in the United States that this is something that can be financially viable. Whether nuclear energy remains a viable proposition more broadly in an era of mixed markets and some deregulated markets will depend on a number of factors. It's going to depend on, for example, our long-term energy strategy and the degree to which we take a portfolio approach to that strategy. I know that when we were talking about this with some of our foreign colleagues and the effect, for example, of natural gas prices on the competitiveness of nuclear energy, the foreign partner in a country that had actually made quite significant investment for a number of decades in nuclear energy said, I don't know what gas prices are going to be in 60 to 80 years. I'm talking about with nuclear power plant, a 60 to 80-year asset. And then if you add the carbon factor, while it is true that we have gotten significant benefit in terms of, I'm sure people have read in the newspaper about our reductions in CO2 emissions in moving from coal to natural gas as a product of the natural fuel switching that has occurred. I noted this morning in April, for the first time that I can recall, you had the share of electricity in the United States, which traditionally has been 50% from coal, 20% from natural gas, 20% from nuclear. It dipped so that the coal portion and the natural gas portion both weighed in at 32%. This had nothing to do with anything other than the economics that we've been sitting here talking about, and it's actually bumped up a little bit since then, but it shows you that there is mobility and there's plasticity in this equation. As we think about how to achieve the President's goal that he expressed in the State of the Union address of doubling from 40 to 80% of our overall power generation in terms of clean sources, nuclear obviously, since it emits zero carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, has a potentially very significant, very important role to play in building, again, that low carbon future. Now, obviously, any path that is selected must be technically sound, and that is something that applies not only to the commercial aspects of nuclear energy, but the one other challenge that we must face and face successfully if nuclear energy is to enjoy in this country the kind of future that many of the people in this room have worked very hard to advance. And here I must acknowledge the signal work not only of Senator DeMint, but of General Brent Scowcroft, because when you have a really, really hard problem in this country, American presidents and leaders for decades have turned to people like General Scowcroft and his co-chair on the Blue Ribbon Commission, Lee Hamilton, two great and distinguished Americans. And it was very, very clear to anybody who's been observing this issue for as long as most of the people in this room have, that we were in something of a cul-de-sac when it came to dealing with that last challenge, which I'm going to address now, which is the back end of the fuel cycle. And Senator DeMint is right, I have been to WIP, and it is a very impressive operation. But I'd like to invite and commend everybody's attention here to the study, the Blue Ribbon Commission that was co-chaired by General Scowcroft and former Representative Hamilton, for the enlightened discourse that it provided on a number of important factors, not least of which understanding the importance of the consent of the communities affected. We have seen other countries, Finland, for example, that have gone about this work in a different way. And it's vitally important to be working from the beginning with those communities, because one thing we know for sure, and that is any policy, such as a nuclear waste policy, the success of which can only be measured over several decades, can only succeed if it's based on the consent of the governed, and if I may say, a wide consensus, traversing party lines, traversing generations. And I think that the Blue Ribbon Commission did a very important job in deeply exploring a lot of those issues. And we have undertaken our own internal review. In February, Secretary Chu announced an internal working group to assess the recommendations of the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's nuclear future and to develop a strategy to address the back end of the fuel cycle. The Commission's report will surely inform that review, of course, but also the considerations and deliberations in the U.S. Congress, whose role obviously is central in developing any long-term successful approach to the back end of the fuel cycle. I can usually, that's Give Me Money by the Beatles, I think. I think. It's definitely the same opening. Look, let me put this in a slightly wider frame. We are engaged, the United States is engaged in a challenge to win the clean energy race for the future. And we are pursuing this aggressively across all energy technologies. We know that for many years yet to come, for decades, that we are going to continue to have a very substantial reliance on oil and gas and on fossil fuels. And that's why we are so dedicated to the important work, actually the extraordinary work, that has been done to develop America's resources. I've already mentioned that we are now the leading gas producer in the world. And the shale gas revolution continues to transform our energy landscape. I think it's well known to everyone here that our oil production is up at levels it hasn't seen in over a dozen years. We added 700,000 barrels a day just in the past year. We are now importing less than half of our oil from abroad. And incredibly, for the first time since 1948, we are net exporters of oil products. We have doubled down on renewables and energy efficiency, literally meeting our objective of doubling renewable energy power generation over the last 4 years. And yes, nuclear has and can have an important and, if anything, a pivotal role to play in continuing the transformation of our energy economy to a more prosperous, higher employment, and lower carbon result. In that respect, it's worth noting for the deliberations of this group and others the ideas that have been talked about: a clean energy standard, a flexible market-based approach that will set annual targets for electricity from clean energy sources. 29 states already have adopted renewable portfolio standards that have supported significant expansion of clean energy. And our own Energy Information Administration has shown through their analysis that a clean energy standard could increase current projections of non-hydro clean power generation by more than 40% by 2025. This is a policy that requires no investment of tax dollars and does not pick winners or losers. The idea is obviously to create a market here at home for innovative clean energy technologies such as nuclear, and in so doing to unleash the ingenuity of American entrepreneurs, American innovators, and help America win this global race for clean energy. I can assure you that we are not out there alone. I think last year alone, $263 billion were invested globally, and it is an intense competition. So, as countries around the world are continuing to review their nuclear options, and I can tell you from literally having talked to people all over the world in the year and a half or so since the Fukushima events, many, if not most, have drawn a very similar conclusion to the conclusion that has been drawn here, which is we need to make sure we take fully into account and apply the lessons of Fukushima, but we still need to consider nuclear energy if we're serious about building a low-carbon future. American leadership doesn't just mean good jobs here at home. It also means a more safe and secure nuclear industry across the globe. In the past few years, we've seen progress and we've seen challenges. We're taking the right steps, I believe, to get us to the destination we all are seeking. But in so doing, as we walk down this road and walk down this road together, we must never lose sight of those first points that we were discussing earlier today. We've got to be safe. We've got to be secure. We've got to address the proliferation threats. We've got to address the environmental issues. We've got to address successfully the back end of the fuel cycle. It's a big challenge, but the stakes are enormous. The future stretches before us. And it starts right here in this room. And I want to thank again all of the people who have both sponsored the studies that are being discussed here today and all the hard work that has gone into them. Because it will only succeed if people in this room think through some of these very knotty challenges, come up with innovative solutions that can command a wide degree of support among a wide array of constituencies and stakeholders. If we do our work well, we will end up with that prosperous and clean future that we all aspire to. And so with that, I would like to thank everyone here for your outstanding work in the service of this worthy objective and wish you all success in your deliberations. Thank you.